Hello and welcome to another Commodore 64 compilation comparison, and the compilation I'm looking at in this video is Classix 1, which should perhaps be displayed that way round. This was published by The Edge in 1987. It's got 5 games on it and it's got a retail price, or it had a retail price of £9.99. So let's take a look at the packaging for this one and then take a look at the 5 games. Here we have the front cover for this compilation there, and as I said, it's in a cassette box, so it should be that way round, but it's probably better off looking at it this way round. So you've got the Classix 1 logo at the top. Classix 1 suggests there's going to be a Classix 2, or there was going to be, but I don't think there ever was. As far as I know, there's only a Classix 1. And it's got 5 games on it, as I said. Some of those are covers of which are on the front here. It's pretty obvious that there's Bobby Bearing on there and Brian Bloodaxe, but then the other 3 are kind of just sandwiched into this little box in the bottom right hand corner, or top right hand corner if you look at it this way around. So let's have a look on the back. Well, let's have a look at the spine first. Ooh, there we go. And it's just a very boring Classix 1 and the name of the system that it's for and the Edge logo. And on the back we can see it says Classix 1 Collector's Edition. 5 award-winning games from the Edge for the price of 1. And the 5 games: Bobby Bearing, Brian Bloodaxe, Quo Vadis. And we've got a price sticker in the way there, so let's just open that up a second. And we've got Wizardry and Firequest. So the 3 other games that are supposed to be represented on the front are Quo Vadis, Wizardry and Firequest. So let's go back to the front and see if we can work out which one of these is which, because I think it's pretty obvious Wizardry is the right hand side. Quo Vadis, some kind of platform game I believe, and the other one, Firequest, again I think it's a platform game, and I don't think either of those 2 things represent that very well. Well, the one in the middle says that's the spirit, it looks like, and the one on the left's got a spaceship on it, so yeah, I don't know what's going on there. You'd be mistaken for thinking this has only got 3 games on it from looking at the cover, and it's not very clear what's going on there at all. The layout's not very particularly excellent either, I would say. So overall I think the outside of the packaging a bit average and not very well thought out. The 5 games are provided on just 1 cassette, and it just says the cassette's recorded both sides, so I don't know if that means all 5 games are on one side and then repeated on the other side, or whether it's like 3 on one side and 2 on the other. So the overall presentation, that's quite nice black label with some yellow text on with the Edge logo, but not a lot of information about what games are on what side, and there's nothing on the back side of the cassette. So moving on to the instruction manual, once again it says it's a collector's edition. It really doesn't look like a collector's edition. It's not got any kind of style about it or any numbering, and we can actually see that the names of the games have been written on the front by a previous owner of this cassette. So it's got Bobby Bearing, Brian Bloodaxe and Firequest on one side, Wizardry and Quo Vadis on the other side, according to that writing there. So just quickly going through the instructions, you've got a page usually for each game. So we've got one for Bobby Bearing, one for Brian Bloodaxe, and we've got one for Wizardry, well 1.5 for Wizardry. In fact there's more there because there's some kind of bit there that says don't read this, so I won't. Quo Vadis has got a page there as well, and so has Firequest, roughly a page each, so that's fair enough. One thing I do want to point out though, the instructions for Brian Bloodaxe, awful. It doesn't tell you anything about how to play the game. It just goes on with a load of jokey nonsense. Basically, I'm not going to go into it in any detail, but yeah, there's no information about how to play the game at all, hardly, apart from the controls. No object of the game or anything like that, I don't think. So yeah, overall the instructions, a bit dog-eared as well, but that's nothing to do with the original release of them, that's just age. Instructions, pretty average again, so average instructions, average cassette, average packaging, it's all just a bit average so far. So that'll do for the packaging. I couldn't find any adverts for this compilation in any of the magazines of days gone by, so let's get on and look at the 5 games.
I'll begin this look at 5 games that I've never played before with Bobby Bearing, which was originally released in 1986. Bobby and his family of bearings live in a metallic land of the future inhabited by many traps and fearsome black bearings. Bobby's cousin has led his brothers astray in the land, and it's up to Bobby to seek them all out and get them home again. You control Bobby, who emerges from his home, and you aid him in his quest for his brothers and cousin. He has to find each of them in turn and roll them back home, but getting past some of the pitfalls you faced on your own may not be so easy when you're pushing another bearing. If you get stuck on any of the screens, you can press any key on the top row of the keyboard to reset the screen. This gets you out of tight places, but you'll lose points, and you'll also lose a family member if it's on the same screen. I'm sure you all know by now that I'm not a fan of this type of isometric flick screen game, but I do always try to give them a fair shot. This is quite obviously a port of the Spectrum version, and there's been no attempt to improve the graphics or game engine for the C64. Most screens only occupy a fraction of the space available, having not been adapted to the Commodore 64's screen resolution, and it uses just a single colour on every one. There's not even a different colour for Bobby or the characters you have to rescue, which could have been easily done on the C64 and would have made them stand out. The animation of your characters and enemies is good and the landscapes are varied, but the game slows down significantly when there's a large landscape or lots of moving objects on screen, which again shows it hasn't been optimised for this system. The physics of the game engine are quite realistic, with Bobby having some inertia and picking up speed on slopes. The control of him is also not bad once you get the joystick aligned correctly in your hand, and he responds well to changes in direction. There's no sound effects in the game, but it does have a nice Jolly Sid tune, though that does get repetitive and boring over time. The game is basically Marble Madness crossed with a fetch quest, as you have to locate your family members and bring them home. It has the typical issues you get with isometric games, as you often get stuck behind landscape objects that you can't see around and struggle to work out what you can and can't get past. The placement of your family members seems to be somewhat random, and you often have to explore the expansive game area a lot to find one of them. Some kind of indicator of where the next one is would have been helpful. Once you do find one, getting them back home is very difficult, and it's easier to accidentally get them killed or stuck. There are some areas that are blocked off or can only be accessed from a certain direction, and you can also get stuck on certain screens, forcing you to hit the reset button and lose time. If you do reset or get damaged by an obstacle, then it takes about 10 seconds for you to be restored to the door of the room, which is also annoying. This is kind of a fun sandbox to play around in, so from a technical perspective it isn't bad, but trying to actually complete the game seems impossible and it soon gets frustrating. I was astonished to find that the game got rave reviews when it was originally released, with Zap awarding it 93% and Commodore User giving it 9 out of 10. For a pretty straight Spectrum port with no obvious attempts to take advantage of the C64 hardware and quite annoying gameplay, those scores seem absolutely insane. Up next we have Brian Bloodaxe, which was originally released in 1985. As I mentioned earlier, the instructions provided with the compilation for this game are dreadful, just being a series of bad jokes for the most part, but the gist of the game is that Brian Bloodaxe is a Viking who was frozen in a block of ice for hundreds of years. When the ice thaws out, he vows to conquer Britain, but he hasn't realised he's woken up in 1983. The player must guide Brian to explore 100 locations looking for the crown jewels and ultimately sit on the throne. Monsters ranging from giant ducks to Daleks and mad Scotsmen patrol each location, making Brian's task more difficult. Objects can be found in each room and Brian needs to figure out their purpose. Up to 3 objects can be carried at once and they can be used to block the path of monsters or make extra platforms. Certain objects can also be selected using keyboard commands and used to interact with the environment and enemies. This is another game that looks like a Spectrum port with its single colour sprites, which are also very flickery. There is lots of variety in the enemies and objects though, and some of the animation is reasonably good. The game's theme is best known as the music from the Monty Python TV show, and it's a good recreation of that tune, but it doesn't take long for it to get boring. The game's clearly influenced by Jet Set Willy, with flick screen platforming action and a variety of quirky enemies. There is a bit more to it though, with some arcade adventure elements as you can pick up and use items, open doors and activate switches. Some of the items are quite clever, like the spade that allows you to dig through some platforms. The controls are fairly good, but there were some weird decisions, such as pushing down to use an item when pressing fire is more intuitive. You get several lives and a health bar, so it's reasonably forgiving and you can get fairly deep into the game if you're persistent enough. That said, you can sometimes be killed going from one screen to the next if an enemy spawns on top of you, so the game design isn't great in that respect. You also have to be wary of falling too far, which will lose you a life outright, and there was no way to restore health or gain extra lives that I could find. You can avoid losing health by jumping on top of enemies and the water, and this technique can be used to get across most screens, which is quite neat. There are also some platforms you can stick to the bottom of using your helmet, which is definitely unique. The game is ugly and glitchy at times, but it's reasonably playable if you like this kind of thing. The ease that you can lose lives if you're not careful means you could easily get annoyed with it though. Game number 3 on the compilation is Quo Vadis, which was originally released in 1984. The instructions claim this was the first game ever to feature more than 1,000 scrolling screens of playing area. You play the part of a knight in search of the sceptre of power hidden somewhere within the maze of caverns. You must beware because the Dark Lord has protected his sceptre well with a host of enemies. If you're to have any chance of saving mankind from extermination, you must find the sceptre before the Dark Lord can awake from his slumber. This is the third game in a row that isn't much to look at, with quite primitive graphics and only 3 colours in use for the most part: red, yellow and of course brown. The scrolling is also quite jerky, which you don't often see on a C64 game, so it's particularly noticeable. There's quite a pleasant background tune, which I suspect is a classical piece. Someone more cultured than I am will doubtless confirm that in the comments. It's not pushing the SID chip by any means, but it's well composed, though inevitably it does get repetitive. There are also some basic sound effects, so overall it's not too bad on the audio side. You start the game on a rope that descends into the caverns, and initially I just kept falling off it and dying, which ends the game as you only have one life. There's a paragraph explaining how to get off the rope in the instructions, which really just demonstrates that the control design was bad if you have to explain how to do it in that much detail. Once I managed to get off the rope and start exploring, the game was fairly playable. There's a huge area to investigate, but the scenery isn't very varied, so it's not really that interesting. There are quite a few blind leaps of faith required where you may end up in a pool of lava which kills you instantly, so this is one of those games where you have to play it a few times and progress through trial and error. Most areas have constantly respawning enemies which can be shot by holding down fire and pushing the joystick in the desired direction. Your character also fires constantly when moving around, which is a bit weird considering he's supposed to be a knight. A sword would have been a much more appropriate weapon. There's no on-screen info about your character's health or score, but he changes colour as his health diminishes, and it can be restored by finding boxes around the environment. From what I saw of the game, there doesn't seem to be any other items to collect other than those boxes. There are what looks like yellow treasure chests on the ground in places, but you can't pick them up. Overall, the game isn't awful, but it just gets boring as you go further and further into the caves, and the more new areas you explore, the higher the chances of an instant game over from a badly timed jump. This is one of those games that tried to be impressive by giving you a huge playing area, but it would have been more enjoyable if there had been more to do, and there are many better options out there in the same style. Let's move on to the next game then. This is Wizardry, which was originally released in 1985. You play the part of Drin the Sorcerer's Apprentice. The Sorcerer has placed you in the Castle of Illusions to work through the final trials of your apprenticeship. Your task is to work your way through a complex maze of castle rooms and dungeons, past deadly creatures such as wraiths, beasts, bats and spiders, and seek potions and spells in your ultimate quest for the Prime Elemental and its utter destruction. The Castle of Illusions is not an easy place to move through. Casting a certain spell in one room may be the only way to make a magic doorway appear in a dungeon 5 rooms away. During your quest through the castle you'll find a number of chests, some of which contain invaluable spells and weapons, while others have poisonous gas that will drain your health. After 3 pretty ugly looking games, it's nice to see one with decent graphics. There's not a huge amount of colour variation, it being mostly browns and blues, but the backgrounds are well designed and the hero and enemies are nicely drawn and animated. It may have an isometric perspective, but none of the rooms have any obstacles in them that obscure your view of the player character, items or enemies, so in this case it suits the game and I don't have any real complaints about it. The scrolling's fine, but the flickering graphical artifacts at the bottom of the play area as you move around aren't a good look. The soundtrack is really impressive, with lots of different tunes that vary depending on the situation you're in, giving it a cinematic feel, and all of them have an appropriate fantasy style to them. Movement to the hero is done using the diagonals of the joystick, which initially takes some getting used to, but works well in the isometric setting and is much better than having to rotate the stick 45 degrees like in most isometric games. The additional keyboard commands for switching inventory items and opening doors also work well, and the status bar is packed with useful info. The game is basically Dungeons and Dragons light and sees you working through the maze of rooms and corridors, fighting enemies, collecting items and solving puzzles. I say D&D light because there's no levelling up and you can't improve your weaponry, but you do have plenty of magic at your disposal. In any location with an unusual enemy or wall-mounted object, it's advisable to use the Telltale spell to help you work out what to do. This gives hints that are usually quite straightforward to work out once you find the relevant items. Other spells allow you to fight enemies such as Hold It and Fireball, and there are also ones specific to the tasks in the game for finding hidden items and restoring health. Fighting with the sword is a bit lame, as you just select the sword from the inventory and waggle the joystick furiously until the enemy flashes and dies, and the on-screen representation of the swordplay is poor. There are chests to be opened in most rooms and plenty of healing spells to be found to restore your energy, so you can make fair progress if you keep an eye on your health, but if you lose it all then the game's over, so you do need to be wary. I found there's generally lots of backtracking to do once you've found the right item to solve a puzzle. It's also possible to prevent progress in the quest by casting spells and missing their intended target, which is rather annoying as it's quite easy to line up your shots incorrectly due to the perspective. There are also some rooms that seem to lock you in if you go into them too soon, forcing you to reset the game, so that isn't great. There's a guide on how to solve some of the game's early puzzles in the instructions, and I probably wouldn't have got very far without that. What's particularly good about it is it also works as a tutorial on how to tackle the game beyond the point the guide itself ends, which really helps you get into the process of exploring and solving puzzles. This game was definitely better than I expected it to be. The overall presentation is good, and while there are a few gameplay quirks that could get annoying, it's quite playable once you get into it, and I got a bit further with each game I played, which gave me the impetus to keep trying. The final game on this compilation is Firequest, which was originally released in 1984 and is a sequel to the 1983 game Ugg from the same programmer. After his quest for food in the first game, Ugg the Caveman has a new mission as he attempts to get fire from a nearby volcano to keep warm. The game consists of various single screen stages that Ugg must negotiate while avoiding creatures and obstacles. On some stages wood needs collecting to build the fire, while on others ladders need to be built to connect platforms or fire must be used to ward off enemies. If you're touched by any creature or projectile or fall from a height, then you lose one of your lives, and when all lives are gone then the game's over. I watched a review of this game on Geigerpunk's channel last year and it looked incredibly frustrating. Little did I know I was going to be playing it and experiencing that frustration myself not long after. This is another game where the coder didn't want to take advantage of the full range of colours available on the C64. This time the only ones used for the most part are green, yellow, blue and red, which makes it look like a Dragon 32 game. To be fair though, the backgrounds are nicely designed and the character and enemy sprites are okay, though they're animated poorly. The music is pretty decent for this era, with a different tune on each stage, and there's also the option to switch to sound effects if you prefer. The gameplay is a mixture of platforming, which often involves precise timing, along with avoiding enemies and moving items around. It's excruciatingly difficult right from the start, though the first stage can be completed with some practice. From the second stage onwards though, it seems to be completely impossible and I had to use a level skip cheat to get beyond level 2, eventually tiring of playing the game by the fourth screen. Just as you start to make progress on any level, something will kill you, and it's usually fireballs from the volcano which home in on you with alarming accuracy. There are many places on the first two stages where you can fall off ledges without knowing it's going to happen, with there just being a pixel's difference between a safe place and certain death. The third stage is especially infuriating as you almost get to the top of the screen over and over again before the fireballs destroy ladders or the shaking resets the level layout. The game requires skill and fast reactions, but it's hard to get better at it as there are so many random factors that will kill you and it's impossible to predict or avoid all of them. It's not a bad idea in principle and the stages are quite imaginative, but it's totally ruined by the insane and unfair difficulty level. That was an extremely underwhelming selection of games for the most part, with all but one being quite ugly to look at and having quite disappointing gameplay to match. You've probably already worked out that I'm not too impressed with this compilation, so let's not waste any more time and get on to the ratings. As always, I'll give each game an individual score before rating the compilation as a whole. Bobby Bearing's a lacklustre port of what was probably a pretty good Spectrum game, with no effort made to adapt it to the C64 hardware. Making any headway to complete the game's objective also seems to be very difficult. The magazines may have raved about it, but for me it's only worth a score of 4 out of 10. Brian Bloodaxe is another naff looking specky port, but the gameplay isn't too bad and it has a few original touches. That said, it's still just an average platform game, so I'm going to give it a score of 5. Quo Vadis is nothing special looks wise, but playable enough if you want to spend ages exploring the huge play area. Ultimately it's quite dull though, and it only takes a slight error to cost you your one and only life, so I'm going to give that a score of 5 too. Wizardry is a surprise standout from this compilation, a rare example of an isometric game done right on the Commodore 64, with graphics that suit the system and a solid game engine instead of just cloning the monochrome flick screen look on the Spectrum. There's also an atmospheric soundtrack and it's quite playable despite having a few niggles. I'm not sure I'd ever bother playing it again, but for the hour or so I spent on it while producing this video it was engaging, so I'm going to give it 7 out of 10. And finally, Firequest was a reasonable concept for a platform game at the point it was released, but the extreme difficulty level and twitchy controls completely ruin it. It's the worst game on this compilation and I'm scoring it 3 out of 10. I'll move on to the overall compilation rating now, starting with the packaging, and the front covers a confusing mishmash of game artwork, some of which doesn't seem to correspond with the titles included in the package. The instructions for the 5 games vary from competent to pointless, and the overall look of the packaging inside and out is quite cheap and nasty. A collector's edition it most definitely isn't, and that means it gets a score of 5 out of 10. The score for the 5 games averages out at a pretty dismal 4.8, and as for value for money, well, 5 games for a tenner seems like pretty good value, but I'd only rank one of them as better than average, and even that one I probably wouldn't bother playing again. I suppose there is some longevity to be had from most of the games, so perhaps if you had no better options then you give a few of them some time, but there were much more appealing compilations out there for the same money in 1987, and for that reason I'm going to give it a value for money score of 6. That means the compilation rating for Classix 1 comes out at an exceedingly average 51%. Let's now take a look at what Zap64 thought of this compilation from their crucial Christmas Compilation Comparison article from the 1987 Christmas special of the magazine. Like all the reviews on this page, Classix 1 gets a pretty compact write-up in the bottom right hand corner of the second page alongside a dark and grainy screenshot of Bobby Bearing. For their views on the 5 games, they say Bobby Bearing is a dextral 3D isometric perspective arcade adventure with fabulous feel, which I don't necessarily agree with. They say Brian Bloodaxe a boring Jet Set Willy clone suffering from flickery graphics, which I do agree with. Quo Vadis is a sprawling exploring game well past its sell-by date, again can't really argue with that. For Wizardry, they say it's an extremely obscure and ultimately unrewarding arcade adventure, which I think is a little bit harsh based on my experience of it. And for Firequest, they say it's an uninteresting and ancient arcade game, which again I can't really argue with. They give the compilation an overall score of 45%, saying apart from Bobby Bearing, a weak and dated collection of not so golden oldies. Once again, I can't really understand why the magazines like Bobby Bearing so much on the Commodore 64, and despite me not agreeing with their opinion on that, I do agree with their overall rating, which is pretty close to my 51%. All that remains then is to see where Classix 1 has ended up in my compilation league table, and looking at the full price compilation rankings first, you can see it's propping up the bottom of the table, its 51% being 3% lower than the previous worst ranked compilation, Fistful of Fun, and actually that 51% makes it the second worst compilation I've reviewed so far, including the budget titles as well. Not surprising when you look at the overall rankings including those budget titles, Classix 1 doesn't even come close to troubling the top 12. That'll do it for a pretty dismal edition of the Commodore 64 compilation comparison, and I doubt I'll be loading anything from Classix 1 up again. If you've got any thoughts about the 5 games in this compilation or the compilation as a whole, then please leave a comment and let me know if you agreed with me or not. And if you enjoyed this video despite the poor quality of the games this time, then please give it a like. I'll be back with another compilation review in the near future and plenty of retro gaming content in the meantime, so thanks very much for watching this video, and until the next one, see ya.